Welcome to Leadership Bites with myself, your host, Guy Bloom. This is a leadership podcast where I have conversations with colleagues, I chat with guests, and sometimes there'll be just me talking. You can connect with me at livingbrave.com, and when you enjoy the episode, subscribe and please tell everyone. I did it last week.
How about I had this one great conversation, got so engrossed, was like, I never recorded this.
Oh, that's brilliant.
And so I said, look, Danielle, this one, I said, look, you have three choices. One is just to hang up, never hear from me again, accept my apologies, or, we could do it right now, just roll it back and start again, or we could reschedule. And she said, no, let's just roll it back and do it again.
And I had Duke Stump, who was the marketing director with Nike and Lululemon, and it's one of those episodes where you can literally see me, you can see my face going, increasingly, you're awesome, aren't you? As I'm going through the episode. So it was probably slightly weird for him to see another grown man kind of slightly getting enamored by just how awesome I thought he was. But when I first tried to make contact with him, I was so keen to get it right that I'd gone into Zoom, was in the room setting it all up, the audio and all of that, and then forgot to come out and actually join the meeting that he was in. I was like, oh, God, I only had one job. I messed it up. But anyway, as they say I think it was Pulp Fiction, into character, and off we go.
Yeah, sure.
So listen, Mark, it's fantastic to have you on this episode of Leadership Bites. Welcome.
Thank you. And I'm so glad to be here, Guy. It's great to be with you.
And super excited to have you on. I saw you on LinkedIn. I started to do what all people now do. I did the Googling, got a sense of who and what you are. So I've done a little intro before we start. But for people that don't know who you are, Mark, it would be great just to hear who you are, what you do, and what you put your energy into.
Sure. So I have a consulting firm that's called Bear Strategic Consulting, and the focus is to help scientists and engineers and entrepreneurs really distill and communicate their value, the value of what they work on to their most important stakeholders. So that could be the public, policymakers, investors, employers, and so forth. I just find that people, it's almost the opposite of me, for sure, which is I'm a verbal communications guy, very little to zero aptitude when it comes to science and engineering. So I work with science and engineers who have the opposite issue. And they have so many great things to talk about, innovative discoveries that they've put together, but they just have trouble communicating that, and it can have huge, consequences, negative consequences, kind of for all of us. If we don't understand science, I think, COVID is really the example of that. The public not really getting it from the scientists sometimes, and not following mandates that are based on science. So I started working on this right after the election in the U.S. and in 2016, when science and sort of facts started to fall out of fashion.
Well, that's a big statement, and I think I'm going to make a note of that, and we'll come back to it, because I think that's the point, isn't it? The social media kind of slant and this relationship with the truth that's going on out there. So we'll definitely get to that. Before we do, I have this kind of little thing that I do now with everybody, which is to go backwards to go forwards, which is I think when people talk, understanding where they've come from and how they've got there, if you know the person a little bit better, it makes it a lot easier to listen to the message. So I'd love to just get that, how did Mark get to be Mark? And wherever that journey starts through to where it takes us, I personally would love to hear it, and I know it adds value for people listening.
Well, thanks. Well, I've always really been in the political world. So just sort of going further back when I was growing up, everything from watching the news to volunteering on political campaigns, but also more than just, I guess, partisan politics. When I talk about politics, kind of talk about, power relationships. How can you get your voice heard? How can you get your viewpoint and your ideas acted upon? And how can you solve problems? And that was something that I learned early on, sitting around the dinner table with my parents, who still are just amazing problem solvers, just going through life and challenges. They were always really adept at figuring out how to deal with a challenge and overcome an obstacle. And of course, as you're growing up, there are lots of those. And so part of that also, I guess, in addition to the problem solving was, what problems are we going to try to solve, beyond our own personal ones? And instilled in me was the value of helping other people solve their problems. And then you start to get into a broader sort of policy making or government, perhaps nonprofit, corporate too, I guess, their issues. And so I remember my mom, stacking and filling our basement with winter coats, for a clothes drive. She just decided that she wanted to do in town, organizing. Actually, one of my early memories of what my mom was working on was trying to get this family out of the Soviet Union, who had been trying to emigrate. They actually were 2 PhD scientists, and they had a son, and they wanted to leave. But Gorbachev and the Soviet regime said no and fired them both from their jobs. And he was working as an elevator operator, I remember. And, they sort of had exhausted all of their options. They went on a hunger strike to get more attention. My mom heard about this, and she organized, it sounds quaint now, but telegrams, telegrams from all 50 U.S. states. And
for the kids, those of you that don't know what a telegram is, Google.
Right. Yeah, right. So she organized those from all 50 states to Gorbachev, and she published, she talked to reporters, she talked to our member of Congress, tried to draw attention to this. And she never would claim credit, and we don't know what impact, if any, she had on the process, but they were let out. They were able to leave. And it made a real impact on me that one person, this is my mom, she's, she was working pretty much when we were home growing up. She was not really working outside the home much, but she figured out how to do this and made this major change in this family's life. So that was a message that I got early on, that actually you're not, life doesn't happen to you. You can help shape it, and you can help shape it for yourself, and you can help shape it for other people. And so that brought me, through college and my focus on government and history. And then after that, working on Capitol Hill in the U.S. Congress for about 4 or so years, and then deciding, I needed to go to grad school. I did that for 2 years. And, that my focus had been kind of government and public policy all along. And when I was my first year, after I finished my first year of grad school, my master's program, I thought, what, I want to experience the business world more. I don't think I really understand or had much experience, firsthand experience, working in a corporate environment. So I went to work for PricewaterhouseCoopers on the consulting side right after grad school, which was really helpful for me to get just different viewpoints. Of course, we're talking about humans, whatever organization, starting maybe from the family unit to multinational corporations, you're still talking about people and how they interact. And, I've always been curious about people's stories and really enjoyed talking with people and learning new things. So from PwC, I went to a startup for about a year, and then 9/11 happened. And I was living right outside, actually not far from where I'm talking to you from now, Guy, right outside Washington, D.C. And so we could see the smoke from the Pentagon. And obviously this was a monumental, searing moment for so many. And so I kind of felt like I was on the sidelines, and it was time for me to get back involved in public policy. And around that time, my former office in the U.S. Congress, called me back and said, "Hey, what do you think about coming back to work in a different role?" And I worked for Ed Markey, who's one of the 2 senators from Massachusetts, and of course, 2 of the planes took off from Boston's Logan Airport, which, growing up in Massachusetts, as I did, I visited all the time. And there's such a Massachusetts part of this as well. And so I went back and I actually focused on aviation security reforms for the first 5 years or so. after I got back, my boss at the time was appointed to a special committee to come up with security reforms to close security loopholes. And so that was really my focus. And then I did that, and I stayed on. And then after we were successful in getting that provisions that I had worked on signed into law, John Kerry got appointed by President Obama to be Secretary of State at the time. And of course, he being one of the Massachusetts senators and leaving that seat, that opened up a new Senate seat for Ed Markey, who decided to run, and I was Ed's chief of staff at the time. And so we had a campaign for the unexpired piece of John Kerry's term, the piece left, since he had left, and then 18 months later, a second election for the full 6 years, because U.S. senators are elected for six years in the U.S. And so Ed won that, and I was Ed's chief of staff in the Senate. And then at that point, I thought, you know what, I want to learn some new things. I was so fortunate to be in the middle of many really exciting, I felt meaningful initiatives that really helped a lot of people. I was just lucky to be there and work for a great boss and work on these high profile issues. And then I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. But I knew I wanted a new challenge. And so I started, that was in 2015. And then the election in the US happened November of 2016. And I started getting calls from people who were just, we were all sort of, if you were a Democrat, you were just stunned. And so as we approached it was almost exactly 4 years ago, now it was early December, the inauguration was happening then, right? And people who had sort of been in a state of denial were starting to come around to the feeling that, no, actually this is going to happen. That wasn't just like a bad dream you had, in November. This is actually
pinched myself a few times. I haven't woken up.
Right. And so, I decided that I wanted to start writing about what was happening, particularly with a focus on all this misinformation that was coming out after the afternoon of the inauguration. January 20th is the inauguration at noon, and it wasn't long afterwards that we were seeing, the White House saying there were more people at the inauguration than there were Obama's, and clearly that wasn't true. But that was just sort of the beginning of this wave that has just built over the last 4 years, from my perspective, of misinformation and disinformation. And then I linked up with scientists who were concerned about that, because really facts and data are the oxygen that enables them to do their job. It's really the oxygen for their professional lives. And they were really concerned. The March for Science happened. I did some work with them. I did more speaking about how to push back against this. I wasn't really interested. People were saying, oh, that's like the thousandth time that they've said something that's not true. And I said, well, that's great, but how do we talk to the people who believe it and get them to actually reject it? And so I kind of geeked out on that and started writing about persuasion principles and kind of combining work I had done on the Hill as far as advocacy, drawing on some classics. I had taken 3 years of Latin in high school, so the rhetoric and the persuasion and the sort of advocacy that I picked up on the Hill, kind of combining those things to work with, to kind of put out like, look, how do we deal with this? And then that's led to what I do now, which is continuing to work with technical people, whether they're big companies, whether they're PhDs and postdocs in university setting, or faculty members who now sort of woke up to the fact that they just can't stay in their labs. They just can't, remain divorced from, the events that can really impact them. They need to get involved, but they didn't know how to do that because it's not the job. Just like I don't know how to use a pipette or, any kind. I think I'd be quite dangerous in a lab. I wouldn't trust myself there. But when it comes to getting the word out and actually reaching people, that's really been my specialty since the beginning.
So there's quite a lot there, and I think the relationship with truth is an interesting one, that and who controls the pipeline and their relationship with it. I've just seen a clip of a Democratic senator holding to task Twitter, Facebook, and Google around what they throttle, what they don't, and all this kind of stuff. So even at that level, there's a whole load of things about how the world is reacting to who controls the truth, what the truth is, how long something maybe stays in the public domain, even if everybody agrees it's not correct. What's the correction period for something like that? And so there's a lot of stuff that wasn't true. You know, I'm 51, so you know, a decade ago, it just didn't. It wasn't like that. And so, is then your sweet spot? This kind of let me work with you to take your information out into the world. But is it also, if it's been misunderstood and misinterpreted, and there's a narrative that isn't working, let me help you course correct that? Is that your domain?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, whether that's in somebody who's even, you know, somebody who might be, say, a biomedical engineer, and his thinking, you know, she's thinking about going into industry after she finishes her PhD, but really doesn't have a lot of training in just how to communicate in a way that's clear and concise. Now, not just to people in her lab, but, you know, to management and other departments. Everything from that to, you know, public policies that are being distorted. You know, you talk a lot, Guy, about connection. Yes. That's really the core of you know, the approach that I use. And connection to me has a lot to do with emotion and connecting with someone emotionally, however you want to describe that. We can talk about that. But this is an area which often is a blind spot for people who have strong technical and scientific backgrounds, because they're really taught to just follow the data and that the data speaks for itself. But we found, you know, particularly in these last 4 years, that science is powerful, but it can't speak for itself. The scientist or somebody with credibility really needs to be there to figure out how to connect with the listener, to get them to understand the vaccine when it gets approved in the US. You know, there are many people who won't want to be vaccinated because they'll be believing these things that are put out there, this misinformation. And so I've been talking about, well, how do scientists and experts actually reach those people? And the tendency is to talk about clinical trials and the fact it's been tested, and we've gone back to the actual research and redone the experiment. I mean, those are all facts, and they're all true. But facts are not enough to move people very, very often. If they were, we would all be driving the exact same color car, you know, all the time, and have all the same things just based on features that the things have. But it's emotional, and that is where this connection is so key that you're expert in, and it's an area where people that I work with often have trouble.
So if I was going to work with you, what is your approach to that individual? Is it an assessment phase? Is it a talk to me about, well, how you almost approach that person, and for you to have the insights that you need even before you start saying that's what we're going to do with you?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, I have an online course. So it's a group experience. I've done it for a few years now, and it's how to effectively communicate your science to any audience. And it was always an online course, which is helpful these days since everything is online. But pardon me, the first module is called connection. And so it's really connection, and then I call construction. Like, let's learn these rhetorical tools that have been effective since humans first started talking. And then it's, okay, combination. Let's take this idea of connection as the prerequisite for communication. Take some of these tools and techniques, let's combine them, and let's have you practice talking about your research in a way that, like we were saying, resonates and is accessible and is exciting and engaging for the general public. And let's have you continue to practice that and get feedback. So we do two rounds of that kind of feedback. So at the end, the scientist feels like he or she really has a tight description of it. So that's in a group experience. In the one-on-one coaching, it does start with, okay, let's talk about, first, I always like to start at the finish line. Where do you want this to be at the end of the experience? Okay, this is what I want it to be. And then working back from that, while I have said scientists and technical people often don't have this kind of feel this comfort in developing connections and sort of talking on an emotional channel, there's so many assets that they do have. Credibility, the public generally believes what they say. Anthony Fauci, his approval ratings. Of course, he's a special case. Could talk about him a lot, but in any case, the idea is that scientists do have assets and things about them individually or them professionally that maybe just need to be reoriented a little bit for a different environment, meaning one that's non-technical, that's general, that doesn't really understand and really doesn't need to know all the little details that often lose and distract audiences. So I do start with an assessment, but basically ask them, like, what do you want at the outcome, at the end of this? And working backwards to find, okay, what assets do you already have? What are you comfortable doing? What are your, people talk about relationship building. One of my students, one of the coaching clients, she said, I have no trouble, starting a relationship and talking to people. I like doing that, but I don't know how to maintain a professional relationship. And I thought that was really interesting. And so we're working on that. And I, come up with things for her to read, things for her to do, things for her to record, to do that in a way that's effective, but authentic, I should say. Kind of going back to the beginning with truth, like all this has to be real, right? Like if this isn't you, then you never want to pretend. If you're on a team and you can't authentically interact with a decision maker, then find someone on the team who can, or hire somebody who could. But you can't play at this. People have a pretty strong BS meter, so you have to feel and has to be authentic.
I was always fascinated by some of the comments around Obama when he spoke, because he's often ordained as one of the greatest orators of our time, regardless of content or whether policy. I'm not interested in that, but just the impact of the man. And I used to sometimes show his inauguration speech or something along those lines when I was doing a workshop. And every now and then somebody would go, yeah, but you can't trust somebody that's that good. Which I thought was absolutely fantastic, as in, all right, so you'd like the president of the free world to be inarticulate and, well, that's a joke there now, but the point is, but, the fact that he's learned his craft and become incredibly good at it and made it something that he wants to get good at, that you don't trust? I'm always fascinated by that.
Yeah, I mean, you had that plumber, and he was really just so good. He must have done something that I didn't notice, right? Exactly. He ripped me off somehow, I'm sure.
Yeah, but I do wonder when you were working with people, there is something like, the clothes that you wear or whatever it is. It may look good on you, but it may not look good on me. So I've got a sense, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's not one size fits all or one look fits all. It's finding their truth, I think, is possibly what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think, like, just to reflect on that comment about, he's too good, he can't be trusted. I think it shows sort of a lack of, I can't relate to that person. Like, right. And, I'm not that good at communicating. He's just so great. Like, there's just this gulf between us, and I just can't get it. But, taking it down to a more, common kind of situation, I think you do want to look for similarities always. And they can be, they can be really sort of trivial. I'll just tell you a brief story about, this woman who was a great PhD scientist, and she was doing research at Ohio State University on wild birds. And so she had come over recently from South Korea. English wasn't her first language. Her English wasn't great. But a lot of her research required that she go out into the farmlands of Ohio around the university and, with her binoculars and look for particular types of birds. Well, in many cases, that would lead to a very irritated farmer barreling down the road in his or her pickup truck, like, what are you doing on my land? It's like that instinctive reaction. And then he kind of sees this woman who doesn't speak English perfectly, is non-white, is different from the people that he interacts with on a normal basis. And so I always say to her, well, Jenny, you were really under the gun, literally, right? Because sometimes they bring, the shotguns in the pickup truck. And so what she said to me is, over time, she got really good at immediately connecting with the farmers. And how did she do that? Well, she started wearing Ohio State football sweatshirts. She started putting Ohio State football magnets on her car. She led by talking about Ohio State football and who they were playing and what was going on in the off season. And everybody in Ohio is fanatical just about Ohio State football. So she would immediately start with this connection, and she would just see the irritation, the tension just melt away, so much so that sometimes these farmers later would call her on the phone weeks later saying, hey, I think that bird you're looking for, I think I just saw it, a few acres of my land. Why don't you come over and take a look? Maybe you should bring it back to the lab to examine it for a bit. And so it all starts with this connection. And a lot of that is built on similarity. And it doesn't have to be something monumental, but it does have to be true and authentic.
And that's something I find very interesting when I work with leaders who sometimes go, yeah, but Guy, I've got better things to do than, try and engage. Now, some people obviously really get it and really understand it. Or some people go, yeah, but I don't want to be Machiavellian about it. It sounds a little bit too contrived. I go, well, but that's if your integrity is in the fact that you want to be good at connecting to people, then putting effort into it is then not contrived. If your intent is to manipulate and do harm, well, yeah, not so good. Yeah. So it's finding maybe a reason for people, I sometimes find, to feel that it's okay to do it on purpose, if that makes sense, and trying to find a reason that they're okay and giving themselves a permission to not just see it as it's not a trick of the trade, it's an actual craft. And I find that quite useful.
Yeah. And, I think the essence, of being human is this need for connection. And I think we're seeing that through COVID when we're so disconnected and people are uncomfortable with that. Right. So as humans, we need to have some connection. So I would say, look, you're on one level, you're being true to kind of the intrinsic qualities of people, which is this need, this feeling that you need to connect. And the second piece, which you alluded to, is, when I talk about persuasion, I always make the distinction between persuasion and manipulation. Manipulation, it's based on things that are not true. You're trying to get someone to do something, perhaps against his or her self-interest, by using lies or other deceptions. Okay, that's what manipulation is about. But persuasion is really finding a way to connect with someone authentically, that enables you to make progress, or to let them really hear what you're saying, maybe act upon what you recommend. But it all has to be, authentic and true. Just one thing about an executive in that kind of situation, it just reminds me of the John Lennon quote, life is what happens when you're doing other things. It's kind of like, okay, well, don't do that and just go do what you think is important. But by not doing that, all these things are happening that will really impact what you are doing that you think is so important. It's like these are not two distinct phases. I have to engage and then I have to do the important stuff. They're really, one is enabling the other. You're actually accomplishing important stuff that you think is important by doing that kind of engagement.
So you work with people on that very personal impact, that their ability to connect and engage, to create trust so the message can be heard, and so suspicion dissipates because actually I'm engaging with you before you maybe even you try and share your message, I guess is what I'm hearing. Right. And when it moves up to almost a product or a policy or when it moves from maybe just being the individual to getting something heard in the world beyond that individual's need. Talk to me about that work and maybe how that might be different, because people then, it's about agendas maybe beyond reaction to person.
Sure. Yep. And look, we can, taking COVID as an example, and maybe, how is the U.S. effectively going to distribute a vaccine once it's been determined safe? Right. I don't mean logistics, but how is the U.S. government going to convince Americans to actually agree to be inoculated? It's going to be a persuasion exercise, and we've done
that thing here. Yeah.
And we've done everything possible leading up to now to make it as difficult as possible, as far as, all the garbage all the garbage information that's been put out there and so forth. And this real erosion of trust and all that. But I guess I would say, when you're thinking about higher kind of initiatives, like when I was on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, we were always putting together coalitions of different groups and looking at, okay, who are our most important stakeholders? Who do we want to persuade, or who do we want to get the message out to? And then who do those people listen to? Who do they trust? It's funny. I say, I would never tell my wife that she needs to exercise more, but if one of her girlfriends told her that, she would. You have to think about the messenger. We talk about communication as really being the foundation. Connection really being the foundation of communication. And then there are the means and the devices to actually get that through in a way that's distilled and clear. But also the messengers are important. And I think they're so important in these larger scale initiatives. So, having, a scientist from the Food and Drug Administration put out information that, this vaccine has been tested, it's been proven, it's been effective. Clearly that's important. But, also having these messengers, these spokespeople who are much more community-based, and they're trusted in their community and they're credible, having them they are connected to these different groups, having them talking about the need for inoculation is so, so critical. And I don't think we're going to do enough of that. That's what I'm concerned about. And not just talking about the facts, but bring in this more. It's a very emotional decision if you think about it. Should I get inoculated? Should I inoculate my kids? This is a vaccine that's never been taken against a virus that's never been out there before. There could be bad side effects. Should my elderly parents take the vaccine? There's a lot of emotion there, and just addressing that with data and facts is not going to be enough. I think you really need to acknowledge the emotion and try to develop that connection using these more grassroots types of structures.
So I'm interested there in the fact that you're almost planning a campaign. You're looking at the points, the stakeholders. You're looking at the people that do have influence. And I'm also just hearing something there about when you're saying it's quite emotive, which it is to a greater or lesser degree. There is something that about the ability of people that are trying to influence to talk to my fears rather than just convince me with facts. Mm-hmm. And that capacity to go, so some of you are going to be worried about this. Some of you will be thinking, I don't know if I want to go first. And it's almost that ability to go into the fears rather than just work under the assumption that the facts will win. And if I'm hearing you correctly, that's a bad understanding of that.
Yeah, that's exactly it, Guy. I mean, you need to acknowledge that. It's that emotive type of message for scientists, who are closest to, say, this particular data and this vaccine development. That's something that they're taught actually not to be, is emotional. Don't get connected to this conclusion because science is growing, and we, don't advocate for these particular findings. Just let the data speak for itself. I did this talk at a university in North Carolina a couple of years ago, and we were talking about, okay, well, what do you think about this particular, scientific finding or this particular policy? This is to a big group of PhDs, postdocs, and the person said, well, the evidence suggests that this is a good choice. So I said, it was really funny to hear him say that, because that term, using that phrasing, the evidence suggests, in the science world is an extremely powerful statement. It basically says, this is really what we think the answer is. But in the policy world, I said, if you came into my office when I was working on Capitol Hill and said, we want the boss to support this scientific endeavor. And I said, well, is it going to work? And you said, the evidence suggests whatever. I would stop listening after I heard the evidence suggest, because it's passive. There's no agency there, so there's like no ownership over this, right?
It sounds like you don't know.
Right. And then you use the word suggest, which is one of the weaker verbs that we have around. And so you see that translation, how things can get lost in translation, but not addressing the emotional component of this in one way or another would really undermine the effort, I think.
I'm almost thinking of that book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. That's the you say, I heard, and all that kind of stuff. And and maybe that's it, isn't it? It's awakening people to somebody once said to me that good communication is the response you get, not necessarily the one that you want. Mm-hmm. And it's a sort of stock trade phrase, but that's what it is, isn't it? It's the fact that your paradigm, that word means that in that language. In some respects, if you went to another country and you were speaking another language in another dialect, you'd have to understand that some of this is about the context that you're using the words. And so maybe it's I can see what you're doing. You're saying that, you're almost getting them to recognize before you do the work. You do understand that when you speak, that isn't necessarily what's being heard, right? And that's what I think I'm hearing.
It's so true, and it's funny. Two things that you said. I mean, well, one is, in your comment, you talked about listening and getting a reaction. Well, just like when you said, some of you are probably really scared or afraid. That's really like a question, right? And so I talk about the need and actually query and questioning as part of this communication and the listening aspect of it. It's so important, not just to make this a one way, make it a monologue, but like you said, you're asking, first you're recognizing the validity of it, but you're also asking a question. It doesn't matter if it's rhetorical, or not, but doing that kind of engagement and maybe getting information back that's very important is helpful. And as far as the translation thing, I mean, it's kind of funny, but I had a situation exactly like this when I was living in Paris. I lived there for a couple months at the time, and my French was sort of like, you learn everything but in school, and then you actually go in a real world and it hits you like, no, actually people live their entire lives in this language. This is when I was back in college and you struggle to keep up. So I was at a restaurant and it was a beautiful day, and I wanted to, I hadn't really eaten out much. I was doing research in the city. I didn't have a lot, living on a stipend. And I thought, I'm going to eat out today because it's such a gorgeous day. I want to sit outside. So I said to the maitre d', I'd like to sit outside, but I'd like to sit on, what I wanted to say was outside, like on the terrace or on the sidewalk, right? And so I used the literal word for sidewalk in French. And I thought, okay, my accent sounded good, all that. Well, he kind of gave me this disgusted look, dismissive sniff, because that phrase I learned, like he said after I said the word, he said, terrace. Terrace, that's the word you need to use in this context, because I learned later that using like the word that I use for sidewalk has almost like a working the sidewalk kind of connotation, which I was completely oblivious about. So it's very much the same kind of thing. Understand the native language is what I like to call it. And it doesn't mean an actual language necessarily, but understand the native language and the expressions.
The demographic you're trying to have impact on.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because when you come, particularly from academia, perhaps, and I get that, people have been in a commercial space, and if they move into a different market, or there's a different age demographic coming through that they're now managing, the words are the same, but the language is different. Is almost that kind of thing, and I think I see a lot of that, and the stuff that you're talking about, that focus for that sort of science community, do you reach outside of that? Because it feels incredibly applicable to anybody that's trying to communicate their perspective out.
Yeah, kind of getting into the leadership, so to speak, aspect of it, and talking to people who want to, make change and move people in a positive direction. I do work with folks who want to do that and don't really necessarily know how to go about it, or maybe they learn some things that they read in a management textbook or management course or something, and they sort of want to graft it onto their particular situation. So yes, I think overall if I had to sort of sum up my professional life, it's like, I just want to make positive change. I just want to make positive change, and I want to help other people make positive change too.
Now, correct me if I've misunderstood this, but, so that's very much the human dynamic. That's working with the person or the team to get their physical message out when it's coming from them. And then when it comes to policy itself, and do you have an interest, or are you involved in enabling the written word or the mechanism that something is read or delivered by not the person but by the product, so to speak? Do you get into that space?
I haven't done as much of that. I'm sensitive to it. I notice things and kind of think about ways maybe that things like that could be done differently. But just so far, I haven't. I should say, too, that, my business is about 4 years old. And I always, tell people, I just love what I'm doing. I'm also open to, other ways of doing things. I started doing occasional live streams on my podcast. I've been using because somebody said, I've got this new report and there are a couple of different authors. And I said, well, maybe we should do a live stream because it's so topical. It just came out, and rather than doing it and recording it and then releasing it later. So I kind of view expansion. I'm just curious by nature, and trying new things is something that makes me happy. So I certainly would think about, stuff like that too.
And what is your podcast called, Mark?
It is called When Science Speaks, and it is at whensciencespeaks.com, and also on, Apple, Spotify, Amazon now, all the platforms.
Here's something I found on reference.com.
Oh.
I said the magic words, made my speaker. Amazon, stop. It's very funny. And the funny thing is that particular company is opening its second headquarters about 15 minutes from my house right now.
Well, you probably ordered a cab there.
Yeah.
So who are you getting on your podcast at the moment?
Let's see. I have had the most recent person that I had on the show works for a big company called ADP in the U.S. And he is an industrial sort of organizational change, organizational behavior type, behavioral economist type. And, so studying how people work in the corporate environment and how to make it more meaningful and things like that. And it's just so much fun to talk to him. That episode hasn't yet been released, but it will be pretty soon. And another episode that I had was, in the US, we have what's called the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. It's really, it's within the Department of Labor and the U.S. government, and its purpose is to make sure that U.S. workers are safe and that they're not exposed to whether it's harmful physical conditions, chemical, any kind of thing like that. And I had the longest serving OSHA director on the show. It was during the Obama administration, basically from 2009 to the end of the administration. He was the head of it, and it was just brilliant because he talked about testifying before Congress and how he made the regulations or the policies that he was hoping to have enacted and passed and then enacted, how he made those real to these members of Congress. And so the bottom line of the interview is he talks about story first, then science. And so he would literally start his testimony by showing a video to the committee of an individual person who was going to work, and then that person didn't come home because he or she was killed on the job. And this policy, he would say, that I'm proposing today or here to talk to you about is meant to stop that from happening ever again. And then he could go into the science after that. But he led with the story, of course, on a scale that we can understand. You talk about policy making, then you start talking about, well, what does that even mean? What's a policy? Who does it affect? How many people? Like, we just can't really conjure that very easily and say, no, this one particular person would have gone home to his family if we had this policy in place. So I'm urging you to, support it. Really, really powerful. So David Michaels is his name, and he's actually working right now on vaccine distribution, and he's part of the Biden transition team.
So listen, Mark, time kind of ticks away with these things, and I keep saying to people as I do these episodes that I have this sense that with the right beverage and the right food in front of us, we could keep going. So I always have to be careful and respect people's time. But if people want to reach out and connect with you, what's the so we've got whensciencespeaks.com, but what other mediums or ways are there to reach out to you, Mark?
Sure. So my website for my consulting company is bayerstrategic.com. So Bayer, like the aspirin. I never use that, by the way, but I think it's probably most helpful in this case. No connection at all from my family to that company, but bayerstrategic.com is the website, and there are contact me buttons on there. And I'd be happy to connect with people also on LinkedIn. If you just, put in Mark Bayer, Bayer, then, we'll find each other, just like you and I connected, Guy.
Fantastic. Well, I'll put all those links in the description as well. So on that note, Mark, I'm going to call us to a halt. I'm going to ask you to stay on just to make sure that everything does what it's supposed to do when we finish.
Sure.
As I've made the accident once or twice and I don't want to do it again. So just from me to you, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, this was so great, Guy. It was great to hear your insights and your perspectives too. I appreciate that.
It's been a privilege. So I'm going to press stop. That's it. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please share so others get to hear about us, and subscribe so you keep up to date on new episodes. Also visit livingbrave.com if you want to connect with me and find out more about executive coaching, team effectiveness, and changing culture. Oh, and of course you can buy my book, Living Brave Leadership, on Amazon. So on that note, see you soon.